I am 49 years old. I am sitting in a room that feels far too large now, watching the ice slowly dissolve in my glass. The silence of the night has its own sound, a low hum that most people desperately try to drown out with useless music or trivial conversation. I don't. I have learned to find comfort in the void. Looking at my reflection in the darkened window, I see a man I wouldn't have recognized a decade ago. Back then, I used to apologize for taking up space. Today, I simply occupy it. There is a story about me circulating in the halls where power is wielded. I heard it last night at a dinner where the wine cost more than the dignity of most people present. It was being whispered in a corner, like a dangerous secret that no one really wanted to touch. They say I was cold. They say I orchestrated, with surgical precision and not a shred of remorse, the ruin of a former partner named David, just to seize his share. They paint me as a predator, a man with no blood in his veins, only tactical maps and an infinite patience for destruction. The truth? The truth is pathetic and dull. I didn't plan anything. I was just in the room when his house of cards collapsed under the weight of his own incompetence. It was a mundane accident. But I said nothing. In the past, I would have spent sleepless nights drafting justifications, trying desperately to clear my name. I had that childish thirst to be understood, to be the just man. Today, at 49, I realize that this lie, this calculating monster they created, is the most expensive armor I have ever earned. It works while I sleep. It keeps the fools away and makes the brave hesitate before crossing me. I've realized that being understood is the consolation of the weak. Being feared through mystery is the tool of those who remain standing. I didn't just let the lie live, I fed it with my silence. Because the truth would only make me common, and the world has no mercy for the common. I look back at the man I was 20 years ago, and I feel a strange mixture of pity and contempt. I was a devoted disciple of the great lie. I believed that if I worked harder, if I was nicer, and if I remained transparent about my flaws, the world would eventually reward my goodness. I lived by the rules of the playground in a world governed by the laws of the jungle. I was the man who walked into a room and sought eye contact for approval, not for assessment. I was looking for friends in places where only assets and rivals exist. Back then, I thought honesty was a moral compass. I didn't realize it was actually a lack of strategic imagination. Every time I shared my struggles or confessed my doubts to my superiors, I wasn't building trust. I was handing them a manual on how to control me. Machiavelli wrote The Prince 5 centuries ago as a manual for reality, yet I was still reading fairy tales. He understood that human nature is anchored in self-interest, fear, and vanity. I, however, was anchored in the desperate, suffocating need to be perceived as the good guy. I used to think that being competent was enough, but competence is just a baseline. It is merely the price of entry. Influence requires a different set of tools. It requires the ability to be unreadable. By being myself, I was giving away my power for free. I was a predictable man, and a predictable man is a controllable man. I was constantly asking for permission to exist, for permission to lead, for permission to be right. I hadn't yet learned that powerful people don't need more friends to share their burdens. They need mirrors to reflect their brilliance and shields to protect their egos. I was neither. I was just an open book that no one bothered to finish reading because the ending was always the same: submission. Then came David. He didn't arrive with a roar. He arrived as a whisper, a master of what I now call the mirror of Narcissus. While I was busy trying to be the smartest person in the room, constantly pointing out flaws and offering honest solutions, David was busy making the board feel like visionaries. I thought I was being an indispensable asset. In reality, I was breaking the first law of power. I was outshining the masters. I was making them feel small with my competence, and there is nothing a powerful person hates more than feeling lesser than a subordinate. I was a threat to their ego, and David was the only one who saw it. The project in Boston was the autopsy of my old life. There were technical delays, minor enough to be managed, but my addiction to transparency forced me to document every single crack. I wrote a report so detailed it was practically a confession. I called it accountability. David, however, saw it as the only weapon he needed. He didn't have to invent a single lie about me. He simply used my own truth as a scalpel. He took my admissions of struggle and reframed them as signs of mental fatigue and instability. He didn't present himself as a rival. He presented himself as a concerned colleague, protecting the company from my unpredictable integrity. I had handed him the knife and pointed to my own throat. This is the brutal reality Machiavelli understood. Human nature is driven by fear and vanity. By being honest, I triggered their fear. By being competent, I wounded their vanity. David, meanwhile, was playing to their fantasies, becoming exactly what they needed to see, until he was so embedded in their world that they couldn't function without him. I was playing a game of facts in a world that only trades in leverage. I was the architect of my own exposure. The breaking point arrived 6 months later. David, intoxicated by the influence he had siphoned from my life, finally made a fatal miscalculation. A high-stakes acquisition he was leading turned into a public disaster, a breach of confidentiality that cost the firm millions and left the board screaming for a sacrifice. David was drowning, and for the first time, the room was looking at him not as a visionary, but as a liability. Then, the whispers began to shift. Because I had spent the last few months practicing the art of strategic absence and concealing my intentions, I was no longer the predictable nice guy. I had become a cipher. People looked at my cold, calm exterior and made a leap of logic that only the fearful can make. They assumed I had planted the leak. They assumed I had orchestrated David's ruin as a slow, surgical act of revenge. They painted me as the mastermind behind the chaos. I remember the afternoon I was summoned to the chairman's office. The air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and panic. He didn't ask me for the truth. He looked at me with a new, jagged kind of respect, the kind reserved for people who are dangerous. He wanted to know how I had managed to be so thorough in my retaliation. In that moment, my old self, the honest man, screamed to speak. I wanted to defend my honor, to provide the evidence that I was innocent, to prove that David had destroyed himself without my help. But I looked at the chairman's eyes and saw the leverage. If I told the truth, I would be a victim of circumstance once again. If I stayed silent, I was the man who could dismantle a rival with a flick of his wrist. I chose the shadow. I nodded slightly, offered no confirmation, and said nothing. I let his own fear write the script. That day, David was erased, and the villain was born. I realized that a lie that grants you power is more valuable than a truth that leaves you common. The transition was instantaneous. The day after the meeting with the chairman, the atmosphere in the office changed. It was as if the air had become thinner, colder. People who used to clap me on the shoulder or interrupt my lunch with trivial gossip now stepped aside when I walked down the hall. They weren't just avoiding me, they were assessing me. I had finally achieved the most valuable currency in the world of power, a reputation for being dangerous. I didn't correct the whispers. Instead, I assumed formlessness. I became a cipher, and for the first time in my life, I was truly seen because I chose to be invisible. I began to apply the art of strategic absence with surgical precision. I stopped answering emails within minutes. I stopped being available for quick syncs that were actually just drains on my time. By making my presence scarce, I made it valuable. When I did speak, I spoke only the language of self-interest, never mercy. I stopped asking, "How can I help you?" and started asking, "Where is the leverage?" I watched as the people around me, blinded by their own vanity and fear, began to project their deepest insecurities onto my silence. This is the power of the psychological void. When you refuse to fill the space with justifications, others will fill it with their respect or their terror. Both work in your favor. I realized that the good guy I used to be was actually an exhausted man, constantly performing for an audience that didn't care. Now, I don't perform. I observe. I became the gatekeeper of information, the quiet strategist who knows the secrets but never trades them for cheap validation. My life became quiet, efficient, and profoundly more profitable. At 49, I stopped being a pawn in other people's games and became the hand that moves the pieces. I finally understood that the mask of the villain is often more honest than the face of the saint. Society is too polite to tell you the brutal truth about power, but at 49, I have the scars to prove it. Power does not care about your intentions, it only cares about your leverage. We're raised on a diet of noble lies, that goodness is rewarded, that truth is a shield, and that if you are simply yourself, you will find your tribe. That is the marketing of the elite, designed to keep the pieces on the board compliant and predictable. For those still climbing the mountain, being yourself is not a luxury, it is a tactical error. It is a surrender of the only weapon you have, the ability to adapt. The truth is often nothing more than a confession of weakness. When you offer your raw truth to a powerful person, you are essentially providing them with a map of your vulnerabilities. You are showing them exactly where you can be hurt, where you can be bought, and where you can be broken. Machiavelli understood this 5 centuries ago. Human nature is anchored in self-interest, fear, and vanity. If you ignore this reality in favor of a moral fantasy, you will always be the pawn, never the hand that moves it. You will be left wondering why your goodness wasn't rewarded while the wicked take the throne. Powerful people do not need more friends. They need assets. They need solutions. They need mirrors that reflect their own brilliance back to them, slightly enhanced. By refusing to correct the lie about David, I stopped asking for permission to exist. I killed the part of me that sought validation and replaced it with a calculated, sovereign silence. The truth would have made me common, relatable, and therefore replaceable. The lie made me a mystery. And in the theater of power, mystery is the only currency that never devalues. You have to decide if you want the comfort of being understood or the freedom of being untouchable. You cannot have both. The ice in my glass has finally melted, leaving only the diluted residue of what was once a strong drink. It is almost dawn now. In a few hours, the world will wake up and begin its daily performance, putting on the masks of honesty and virtue to hide the fear that governs every decision. They will spend their energy seeking approval, explaining their mistakes, and begging for a seat at tables they were never invited to. I used to be one of them. I used to think the light was where safety lived. I was wrong. Safety lives in the shadows you control. Accepting the lie about David wasn't about being cruel. It was about achieving radical autonomy. I realized that I don't owe the world a true version of myself. I only owe myself the power to remain standing. At 49, I have discovered that the most profound freedom comes when you stop caring if you are the hero of someone else's story. When you embrace the void and let the world project its own demons onto your silence, you become the sovereign of your own mind. You become an organ that cannot be cut out of the body of power because you have made yourself necessary through mystery and results. So as you watch this, look at your own life. Are you still playing by the rules of the playground? Are you still exhausting yourself trying to be understood? Take a breath and let these laws settle in. The world isn't built on transparency. It's built on strategy and leverage. You can remain innocent and continue to be a pawn, or you can grab the wheel. This level of psychological mastery is not a destination, it is a daily practice. Stop asking for permission to exist. If you are beginning to see through the veil, perhaps you've realized that throughout this account, I applied 13 ruthless laws of power, the very same laws David never saw coming. They were my invisible armor while I walked through the fire. The world is designed to put you back to sleep, to make you compliant, to make you a pawn in a game you don't even know is being played. Most people will finish this video and go back to their lives of explaining themselves and seeking permission. They will remain invisible. But if you are still here, it means you've felt the strings. It means you're ready to see the board for what it really is. If you choose to click the subscribe button, do not do it to support this channel. I don't need your support. Do it as a contract with yourself. Do it as a signal that you are done being a spectator and are ready to become a strategist. By joining this circle, you are choosing the hard truth over the comfortable lie. To master the 13 laws that changed my destiny, watch the next video on your screen. The transition from puppet to puppeteer starts with a single, silent decision. Welcome to the inner circle.